back after. So keep that in mind because there's a lot of terms and names. So we talked about those antibacterial drugs that act on the cell wall, interfere with cell wall synthesis. And what they're called, so penicillins and cephalosporins, I've introduced those. They're all fall under the beta-lactam antimicrobials. And what they have is there's some of the information you don't need, or you don't need to memorize. I'll show you the structure is a 3-carbon, 1-nitrogen ring, and they're important. And number one, because they're one of the first penicillin to actually be developed, and also because they still make more than half of the antimicrobial drugs. So beta-lactams is the term, and this is how they look. So this is the beta-lactam ring, 3 carbons and a nitrogen, and then there is the thiazolidine ring. And this is why this is purple, and you can see that here. You can look for a long time. You're never going to find a difference, hopefully, unless I left something out that comes in by a click. They call it the nucleus, but really what it means is this is the structure that doesn't change. So all these are identical, and then what changes are the rest. So you have a rest group and a nucleus, but what it means is you have the basic component of it is the beta-lactam and the thiazolidine rings, and then these rest groups. What's interesting about those is they could be synthesized in the laboratory, so that it would be possible to actually synthesize those, but it's more economical to still obtain them from natural penicillin or from the sources such as molds or in this case molds only. And what they then do is you can bring those substances, or you bring the penicillin into the laboratory and modify it so they become semi-synthetic. So you then play around with the actual compound and maybe exchange groups, etc. So again, you have the nucleus and then the variable side chain that dictates the microbial activity. So there's probably no end in possibilities of what you can attach, and then a lot of it has to do with, there's obviously people behind it who know the biochemistry of microbial cell wall production and assembly, etc., and they're making educated guesses of what group would work what way, but then it still takes time and a lot of money to figure out, is this going to be affecting, how is it going to get into the body, how is it affecting the host cell, how is it affecting, how effective is it against bacteria, which bacteria, etc., etc. So there's a lot of research going into that, but it's in most cases, or in a lot of cases, it's worth it, because if you can find a good compound or a good group of compounds, and then sell those for quite a while, there's a lot of money in that and a lot of possible cures.
Which part attaches to the cell wall?
Well, remember it doesn't attach to the cell wall. It actually affects the synthesis of the cell wall.
Okay.
So somewhere in the process, it might attach to an enzyme that's used to produce the cell wall. So it could be that this group attaches to the active site, things like that. So it could be
the nucleus group or the other group? I'm just wondering why have all those different things on there? What difference is there?
I would say the nucleus group, because you keep that constant, so you wanna keep a part constant. I don't know. Like I said, there could be a lot of differences between So if you use, for example, the basics, if you use penicillin, it doesn't work for all bacteria the same way. So by changing the groups, you may be changing the way it affects the enzymatic reaction. So if you would have penicillin and it would already affect every single cell, then you probably wouldn't have to change around. And the other thing is resistance is developed, etc. But I don't know specifically how these rings change anything. There's probably, if you look at those nacillin, so you have some of those up here, the semi-synthetic ones, that then create a broader spectrum of infections or infections they can actually be applied to. So it probably changes the spectrum of bacteria, the way the inhibition works. But I don't know the specifics of what exactly the groups do in the process of building the cell wall. The natural forms are penicillin G and V is what they're called. Just so you've heard of those, and those are the ones I think penicillin G is the first one of the two. The first one that was found. A lot of times it's used for gram-positive cocci. Again, that's nothing I'm going to ask you, like what is penicillin exactly, because there's some gram-negative bacteria that they work against too. So it's memorizing something you're going to automatically forget once you walk out of this class. Just remember they're usually natural. There are some semi-synthetic penicillins which are produced in the laboratory after the molds are producing the basic compound. But what's also important is, and we'll look at that later on again, there's a lot of bacteria or the resistance has been built up in bacteria by enzymes called penicilliases, or penicilliases. So penicillin, the drug that actually prevents the assembly or the production of cell wall, can be enzymatically made non-functional. So some bacteria, basically, we have a war going on where one produces, in this case it's a mold, but for one microorganism produces something that's toxic to bacteria, but then they gain resistance by producing an enzyme that actually disables that toxin. So there's some, and that's probably where this comes in, there's new groups, and nacillin is one of them, for example, where you have penicillins that are now penicillinase resistant. So now you have a third level of weapon. You have penicillin coming in. They say that's easy. We're just gonna produce an enzyme that makes it dysfunctional, and then there's now a group of penicillin-based drugs that are actually resistant to that enzyme. So you can imagine that over years the list is going to get longer of what they're inventing. The main problem with penicillin is that it can cause allergies and, again, resistant strains of bacteria. So there's quite a few that are producing the penicillinases, and so you have to. It's not as when it first came out, or when penicillin first came out, it was, like I said, the miracle drug, and it's not as effective anymore, especially the first forms. So now they're constantly being tweaked to make them more effective and to work against the strains that are already resistant.
Do you think that these penicillinase resistance, do you think they're only prescribed if the regular penicillin doesn't work? Like they just take it to the next level?
Yeah, and then there's tests just like the one we looked at. There's tests for that. I think that's usually the case. There's different ways of, for every, there's a list of antibiotics and that you can, you would find for certain bacteria. So once you come in and it's determined what you're suffering from, which is the ideal case, not always works that way. I think they said in like throat infections, things like that, you have antibiotics just prescribed, and 75% of them are viral. So doctors just automatically give it to you, and it's only really going to do anything in 25% of the cases. So, but if you would go through the list, you would look, and then you would probably start with I would imagine you'd start with the penicillin first, and then a lot of times, and it doesn't necessarily, or it won't work, and then you'll have to go the next step, because it's not easy to figure out which strain you have and which one has already developed a resistance. I don't know how much is known initially, when you determine the microorganism, if you can say they're resistant initially, that might have to be tested first. But in general, that's the way it would go. You leave that one out because you already know penicillin alone wouldn't work. So just back to this, that's the real basics. So if you see any name compounds, drugs that end with cillin, they're usually part of the penicillin group, and they're produced by molds, affect the cell wall synthesis, and that's just the most basic information about penicillins that you should know. And then the cephalosporins remember they fall under the same, in my head, fall under the same category, go in the same order, because they're also produced by molds. They also affect the cell wall, and what you find in their names is usually Ceph, Kef. So there's a few down here, Cephapime, Moxalactam, Cephotiam. So you've got different compounds. Just look for just try to figure out, once you see them, you see that the basics looks a little bit different, some similarity to penicillin, but you'll again have a compound produced by an organism, a mold, and it's pretty big. It accounts for about 1/3 of all antibiotics. They again fall under the beta-lactam structure, so the structure is a little bit altered. Those are mostly resistant to penicillinases, so they're kind of like where these, we have them here, where these fall under, so they also are resistant to some of the organisms that produce penicillinases and cause fewer allergic reactions. And when you see this, some are given orally, so you can ingest them, but then many must be administered, and then it's parenterally. I don't know how you pronounce that here, but basically, don't look at it as a parent something. So it's para, like passing the intestines. So you will have to you can't administer it orally. It's administered through like injections in your bloodstream, things like that. So they're similar in a lot of ways. So just remember the cephalosporins, also molds, also affecting the cell wall. And if you can remember one or two, that would definitely be good. Remember the Ceph in their name. And this is just another example, which you don't have to memorize. Just remember that maybe that there's usually works in generations, or it works in it's a progressive. how do I call it best? The generations of these drugs are being produced, and usually they perform better and better, but they're in response to, for example, resistance, or in response to changes in the functional groups that you synthetically add or take away. So you have different groups of cephalosporins, or different generations. This one, for example, it has the widest range, and then you can go all the way back up. But usually, each group is more effective against certain bacteria than the one before. And it's usually what the goal is, and we talked about it I showed you in the table in the beginning. The dosing is important because, how it's administered, and how the patient has to take it is an important part of how they work, how successful they are, and then you also want to reduce the side effects. And I don't know if that's just something I hear all the time, and I remember myself being part of that problem. When you have a lot of patients, you think they want to get cured, and you're sure if you tell them all you have to do is really take 3 pills a day, you can bet that they don't. And I heard on the radio, which I wanted to go back to at some point. They were talking about Russia, and we talked about this in the very beginning, tuberculosis and how it's coming back. And they say in Russia, what they talked about, they've interviewed nurses there, and there's just a lot of places in that country where they find resistant tuberculosis, and they don't know, they really are running out of options. And there was one example of I guess a prisoner who was part of the interview, and he said, he said he's had it. I think he had his first tuberculosis, and it was really easy to cure. Would have been really easy to cure, but that's one of the ones where you have to give medication for a long time. So it's not just a week, or he's I think the first one was probably a couple months, but he said he just didn't really follow with the instructions. And a lot of times what you would see is that if you stop even antibiotics, you say, oh man, I forgot yesterday, I'll just take double today, but you're giving the microbes always this advantage by all of a sudden the drug is gone, and it can actually grow, and if you have anything resistant in there, it can multiply, and you don't keep the pressure on it. And so I think he was in there the third time. He had the third time they found it, and now he said he has some strain that is absolutely, they have no idea how to cure it. There's no medication.
So when you're skipping doses, it affects the resistance. The next time you try to take it. My brother's an ER doctor, and he said that he will give, instead of giving something like, I don't know, amoxicillin or something that has to be taken 3 times a day, if it's a child that comes in really sick, and he can tell from how the parent is, if they're not high quality parents, he will give them something like a Z-Pak that you only have to take once a day, because he thinks they'll have a better chance of actually getting the medicine.
Yeah.
Versus the other, he just they have no hope of overcoming it with the other.
Yeah, and it's I mean that it was interesting because that inmate said he now understands his responsibility not only for himself but for his own health, which is already a step beyond what a lot of other people in that interview were saying, but also in his responsibility towards society and what he's passing on. But I remember too, just thinking, which is interesting. I think I didn't always follow the rules, especially earlier on, where and I got medication and I thought, do I really I'll just do it 5 days because you can't drink when you're taking things like that. Whatever, I'm over it. But then it always seemed to me at the same time really simple, because I thought, okay, there's a whole, that was always my idea was, I go into into a doctor's office or in a hospital, I usually don't pay for it because it's covered, and all these people are here to figure out what's wrong with me and to help me. So all I have to do is take these pills, and they say, yeah, but you're not going to do it, I know. And I thought, I can't believe they don't trust you with it, because it's really the simplest part is yours. You don't have to do anything but take something 3 times a day, and it still doesn't work most of the time, or I don't know most of the time, but there's a huge problem with that, and as Diana said, it relates to resistance, but it also it just can affect you initially. It can affect what you're passing on to others. So just follow through with the treatment.
So if you give it in small doses, where it doesn't put enough pressure on the one that's trying to attack, does it kind of like just adapt and like?
Well, there's different. It just seems like the more time they have, and there's always usually, because if you think about like when you plant bacteria, how many million there are, and to actually see them on a plate, if you think about like what concentration you need in your body, it's a lot. So they're constantly dividing. They're just growing like crazy. So if you don't keep that growth in check, you're always going to have a resistant one. But if there's, or most likely you're always going to find that at some point. But if you have the right drug, and it's not going to be able to replicate fast enough, and it's gonna basically be dying with all the rest. But if you keep them on a level where there's some growth, or you take everything away. The other thing you have to remember is if they're broad spectrum, for example, you might take out a lot of bacteria that are competitors, and the resistant one all of a sudden has all these resources and can actually expand or grow exponentially much better than before, because you've taken antibiotics that taken out a lot of other antibiotics. So there's different possibilities or different ways how that affects your own and everybody else's health. And these are just, so you've seen them fasted traits, and I think I've seen that at home. Ointment usually. This one is pretty strong. I think. Was that also Mycobacteria? But anyway, this one is a pretty strong one. Those are non-beta-lactam cell wall inhibitors. So these have, in comparison, and I just wanted to show you those 3 in comparison to penicillin and cephalosporin. They have a different structure, but also inhibit the cell wall synthesis. So if you have, for example, a patient that's allergic to penicillin, you can give this. But this is a very strong one. It's toxic and hard to administer, so it's restricted. And sometimes I think there's cases where you have somebody allergic and there's a lot going on, and you say, I know this is, as a doctor, this is going to be possibly damaging, or not damaging, but affecting other, organs, liver, etc. But I take that over the infection. So there's always choices, tough choices sometimes to make. This one is, I hope that's not the one I thought of earlier, but this one is, I just left that in because it interferes with mycolic acid synthesis. So Mycobacterium tuberculosis is, and we talked about the stain and the mycolic acid. So this is one that would affect exactly that mycolic acid synthesis, isoniazide. So the cell membrane, we talked about these, or this one already. That's really the only one that, remember that picture, I put it here a little bit smaller. Again, we've looked at this already, how it affects the cell membrane and basically produces these dysfunctional cell membrane. It's really all I wanted to say for this one. You don't have to remember these kind of things because there's so many different drugs that you can take for UTI. or different other microorganisms that you don't have to remember what exactly they what's exactly their specific condition is when they're being applied. And then we talk about cell wall, cell membrane. The fluoroquinolones are the ones that, and we looked at those before, are the ones that act on the DNA and RNA. And we talked a little bit about this, how they bind to certain enzymes, this topoisomerase 4 or DNA gyrase. So those are enzymes that are needed for bacterial DNA replication. And so because that's such an essential process in the bacterial cell, it's a broad spectrum, it has broad spectrum effectiveness. Norafloxacin and ciprofloxacin, or I think they call it Cipro usually. Those are two
all those end in ACIN?
I don't know if they all do. Even for the penicillin-based ones, you don't always see the -cillin ending. I don't know if they're. And then what the problem is too, that a lot of different companies use the same compounds, and they call their products different names. So then you have that in addition to it. But maybe you remember the quinoline drugs or the fluoroquinolones just as a group affecting DNA and RNA by affecting or binding to enzymes that are needed for replication. And they've been pretty successful or pretty popular, and there's now a concern that they're overused, and they're the Center of Disease Control is recommending careful monitoring to prevent resistance buildup in bacteria. And then the protein synthesis, we'll go through a couple of those. I almost wanted to throw in this. I'll show you now, and then never again. You can go there with your book. So if you go onto those, because we talked about where in the ribosomes they affect or what they are, the aminoglycosides. So if we start with those, you can go in your book to that page if you want. That's the first one. This is what they look like. Just the xenom ones. There's a lot of different structures that are gonna not stick with you, but they bind the ribosomal subunit. That's the most important part. So that's part of how they act. The 30S. There are a lot of various different species produce those. They're usually soil microorganisms of the genera Streptomyces, and then also Micromonospora. And so you have streptomycin, for example. They inhibit the protein synthesis, which is clear if they attach to the ribosomes. That's how they work. I don't know if there's anything else I wanted to say about those. So just remember aminoglycosides attaching to the ribosomes, maybe the 30S if you want, and that they're produced by soil microorganisms from the genera Streptomyces and Micromonospora. And then tetracycline, that was the bottom one, same thing, protein synthesis by binding ribosomes. There's a few diseases you can see on the slides if you download them, what they're used for, or what they're administered for. And there's some side effects with tetracycline. I remember hearing about this a long time ago, but gastrointestinal disruption. So they're having there's some more severe side effects connected with tetracycline. And then chloramphenicol was also in that list of ribosome attaching protein synthesis blocking ones. See what I need to say here. Very toxic, restricted use, so you might not find those that often. It's more severe cases where you already have resistances are probably going towards antibiotics that are more toxic for us, can cause irreversible damage to bone marrow. But these are typhoid fever, for example. There's like pretty important and severe infections that it's applied for. And you can see just by even though those are all protein synthesis inhibitors, and they affect different areas in the ribosome, their toxicity is different. They're not all, if you go from tetracycline, they're more toxic. Those are probably the least toxic ones. You've got a couple of those. So the toxicity changes with what specifically they're doing in their specific structure. But they all affect the protein synthesis by binding to the ribosomal units. And then the last one in this group is they're called macrolide erythromycin. That attaches to the 50S subunit. So that one attaches to the bigger unit. It's a broad spectrum and has a lower toxicity. Here are some of the applications, and as I said before, prophylactic, for example, for surgery can be given. So if it's a less toxic one, it's usually more qualified to be taken prophylactically because you don't want to expose somebody to an antibiotic and risk anything without even having an actual infection. I just want to see where we can stop. I think after this one. So back to the sulfonamides. We talked about that. So that's the group. So I think we went through. Maybe the only one. This is the one that remember the folic acid production. How sulfonamides inhibit the enzyme that is part of the PAVA metabolic pathway. And I just put this in because that was part of what we talked about on the first day, where this compound was found to be able to have that effect on infected people, and so it was a huge discovery. And we already talked about that it's a narrow spectrum, blocks the synthesis of folic acid. There are these different compounds, and there's trimethoprim, which is usually given in combination because it blocks the second enzymatic reaction. So you have that working together with the sulfonamides. You can look at that. I posted that as a PDF. So if you would be asked to look at a following drug, and that could be one of those. We've talked about this one: tetracycline, erythromycin, chloramphenicol, sulfonamides. Which one would you pick for these ones? We just did those, so should be fresh on your mind. So, as I said, don't worry too much about every single, all the different, or the specifics about how they affect, or what kind of morphological structure or morphology of bacteria they affect. It's more important to me that you know how they're produced, what produces them. Are they synthetic or are they produced by an organism? And then what's their mode of action? How do they actually interfere with bacterial growth or bacterial well-being? And then we'll have to do a little bit more. Oh, this one was for the end. This one is, can you believe like in other colleges they give you a whole lecture just on how to be a good student. And you just have to watch the Tour de France, and you know. So this is a way better. This is a way better approach. Which I don't agree with all of this. I mean, this is pretty crazy, right? And that's like for a regular. I mean, I'm not sure. 20. What do you guys? 25 hours? Anybody or more?
Right now.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah?
estimating it probably about
Wow.
half that.
Oh, yeah, those.
And then work, you can't really just control that. That one, you guys are all doing pretty good. There's nobody. You see everybody most of the time. I don't know about this. Does anybody rewrite class notes? Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
The question is, is it painful or is it easy because you're doing all kinds of...
No, the thing is like I read